NBA trade buzz, off-season buzz, whatever you want to call it, is kicking up a bit as we near the NBA Finals with most teams' seasons over, and teams are already trying to figure out how to get better going into next season. And I know this is a little late, and I've had a lot of people ask me recently, hey, what are your thoughts on these rumors specifically as it relates to the Clippers and their interest in DeMar DeRozan, as well as some of the trade rumors being linked to the Sixers and Zach Lavine. And so I wanted to share my thoughts on the matter, and I would love to hear your guys' take on it as well. So what's going on, everyone? You were listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I guess I'll start with the recent news that was reported from Mike Scotto on Hoops Hype is that one team to keep an eye on that could pursue DeMar DeRozan if he doesn't re-sign with the Bulls is the LA Clippers, should they lose Paul George, who has a player option in the final year of his deal going into next season to the tune of $48.7 million, which he'll likely decline regardless of whether he leaves the Clippers or not, because he's going to want to re-up for more on a longer-term deal, as this could possibly be his last big contract before he starts to decline as a player. Now, I hate to be the bearer of bad news for all those Bulls fans who want to see DeMar gone and the Bulls taking a step back and starting to rebuild for the future, but even as Mike Scotto indicated in his report, that the belief around the league is that DeMar DeRozan will ultimately re-sign with the Bulls, given the Bulls are still looking to compete, DeMar obviously the number one guy on the team, and the fact that the Bulls are likely going to hand him a fat contract, one that not a lot of other teams are going to be able to afford in signing him. And while I hate to shut down this rumor and move on, but as far as my thoughts on the matter, yeah, I think there is little to no chance that the Bulls execute a sign and trade to send DeMar to the Clippers. And the biggest reason for that is Paul George isn't going to be going anywhere. There's been talk about, and the Clippers aren't necessarily willing to offer him the full max, which is what he's expecting. There's been talk about Paul George being frustrated playing on the same team with Kawhi Leonard, as he's always hurt. I don't doubt that some of that is true, but they're not going to let Paul George go. They're going to offer him a max extension, and quite frankly, I don't think Paul George would want to go either. He's always wanted to play in LA. He's still playing for a team that is a title contender. Their biggest issue is they just can't stay healthy for the whole season. And to be honest, that also applies to Paul George, not just Kawhi Leonard. Like, he can't really get mad at Kawhi when he's had his fair share of availability issues, including in the postseason. But no, PG isn't going anywhere, especially with the Clippers investing billions into that new stadium that's opening next season. They need fans to remain interested. They need to fill out those seats. They're going to need the star power to bring people out to the games. They're going to re-sign Paul George. That said, in the extreme off-chance scenario that Paul George does in fact leave, maybe he's even willing to take a discount to play with a more formidable team. Very unlikely, but we'll roll with it for now. I could see why there would be interest in DeMar DeRozan on the Clippers front. One, because DeMar is still playing at a high level. It's not like he's fallen off as a player. Two, while he might not be as big of a name as PG, and I think most would agree that all around Paul George is a better player, but DeMar, his talent, his name would still enable the Clippers to be competitive. It would still keep the fans interested to go see them play at the new stadium. And then finally, I could see why DeMar would be interested, because we know he's from that area. We know he's wanted to play for LA in the past, albeit for the Lakers, and if Paul George leaves, DeMar would have a significant role on that team. Now, it would have to be a sign and trade, of course, since the Clippers don't have the cap space to sign DeMar outright as a free agent, even if Paul George leaves, given the Clippers are already over the luxury tax line and actually a second apron team, I believe, so they don't have the ability to use the full mid-level exception. So in order to get DeMar paid his fair value and the amount that he wants, the Bulls would sign him as a free agent and then would trade him to the Clippers, where they would take on his contract and be able to operate over the cap, since they now have effectively acquired him in a trade rather than through a free agency acquisition signing. I know most of you know how sign and trades work, but wanted to outline what it means to sign and trade a player for those that weren't familiar. It's more or less a workaround, or a loophole, if you will, for high salary teams who don't have the money to sign free agents to acquire them by way of free agency, but where their current team signs them to a contract and then they're subsequently traded. Now, I know I've already mentioned this whole sign and trade scenario for DeMar DeRozan to the Clippers to be unlikely, but in my view, what makes it even more unlikely is who are the Clippers trading in return for DeMar DeRozan? Because if DeMar is reportedly going to be commanding close to $40 million annually, the Bulls would have to take back close to that amount of salary in return. And if the Clippers are still looking to be competitive and want to keep their current core intact, what players are they going to be able to include to match in salary? Now, there is James Harden, who's going to be a free agent, and maybe they do a double sign and trade for both of these players. But man, Harden in a Bulls uniform, killing the development of those young players, I don't know, that doesn't strike me as appealing at all. Now, not only that, but it also means paying Harden a hefty contract for a guy who's already starting to show signs of decline. But really, outside of that, who else? Norman Powell is their next highest paid player outside of the big three at $19.2 million. Then you've got old man PJ Tucker, who's about to be 40 years old. He's got a player option at $11.5 million. Zubac, they're not trading Zubac, who is on a team-friendly contract. I just don't see how they're going to be able to make the dollars work if DeMar is going to be getting close to $40 million a year, even at $30 million. I don't really see a path unless, of course, it includes James Harden, which makes me very uneasy as a player I've never been a fan of and his game. But then again, I don't know, man. I guess I wouldn't put it past AK with his desire to keep this team competitive, and signing an old James Harden to replace DeMar would be one way to do it. Now let's move on to Zach Lavine. Of course, we know the Bulls' focal point this summer is to move Zach. Obviously, they tried last season, but given the lack of interest for him, they weren't able to find a trade partner. But now with the season nearly over and some teams may be looking to make big changes to their roster after failing to get further into the playoffs than they had anticipated, that interest level could change. I'm still a little skeptical that teams are going to be willing to give up a lot for Zach, especially coming off a major injury and especially at his contract with still 3 more years left on his deal. But sure, I do think that there could be options at play this offseason, especially when you consider that trade opportunities are more frequent in the offseason when teams with cap space have the ability to absorb Zach's contract without sending equal value in salary out to the Bulls, which is also attractive to the Bulls because if they're able to take back a lot less in salary for moving off Zach's deal, it could position them much better as it relates to re-signing DeMar and Patrick Williams while remaining under the luxury tax. And for the Sixers, I mean, they're flushed with cap space going into this offseason. They actually have the most cap space than any other team this summer. Now, they're obviously going to need to pay Tyrese Maxey a big contract, who is a restricted free agent this summer, and they're going to need to re-sign Buddy Hield after they just made a big trade for him. Are they going to fully guarantee the contract of Paul Reed? How about DeAnthony Melton? So, I mean, the cap sheet is going to fill up quickly for them. Like, sure, they have a ton of cap space right now, but a ton of open roster spots that are going to need to be filled. But trading for Zach Lavine, I've said this before, but the Sixers are one of the few destinations where Zach actually makes sense, and one where I think they could have some interest. I never bought the interest level of DeMar in Philly when he's the antithesis of what Daryl Morey wants in a player, a guy who has always been about maximizing the three-point shot and using analytics to win games. The man hates mid-range shots. That's DeMar's bread and butter, though. But for Zach, while he does have a good mid-range game, he's still one of the more efficient three-point shooters in the league. He can be a bit streaky at times, but people forget that he was shooting near 42% on 8 attempts per game in 2021, the year that he was a first-time All-Star. And while that percentage has dipped slightly in recent years, you could argue part of that is the change in his role on the team and the limited spacing with DeMar DeRozan. Morey could look at that and say, hey, in a new environment, a new system, Zach could thrive here and be just the player we need to complement Embiid and Tyrese Maxey. Another shooting threat and a player who can play off the ball as a great catch-and-shoot shooter. I'm sure the injury concerns are going to be there, but if you're the Sixers, a team that knows they need to act now to keep Embiid happy and maximizing his prime and building a contender around him, you might have to take risky moves to be able to keep Embiid engaged and wanting to stick around. And for the Sixers, again, because they have the cap space to absorb Zach's salary, they likely don't need to give up much to get Zach Lavine. I'm sure the Bulls would love to have one of their first-round picks, but I doubt the Sixers would go for that when they know there isn't much of a market for Zach and the Bulls have very little leverage. But maybe a couple of second-round picks and potentially a sign and trade for Buddy Hield, which is a downgrade for the Bulls from a talent perspective, but they could get Hield on a more team-friendly contract, shorter-term contract. And one thing that Hield does excel at that the Bulls need is shooting. Maybe they could execute a sign and trade for Tobias Harris, although I'm not really interested in Harris, who has really fallen off in recent years as a player, and I don't think that moves the needle for the Bulls at all. I would love for them to pick up a guy like Paul Reed, but I don't think that's realistic, as I'm sure the Sixers are going to want to hang on to him as a young backup center, especially knowing Embiid's injury history. But regardless, I could see a trade of some kind working out where Zach goes to the Philadelphia 76ers. I still think the Bulls are going to be hard-pressed to find a trade for Zach until the trade deadline next season, when he's able to demonstrate his value coming back from an injury, but the Sixers are one team that I think works and could be a good fit for Zach. At the end of the day, though, I think the most likely scenario in both of these instances is DeMar re-signs with the Bulls after Paul George re-ups with the Clippers. The Bulls try and trade Zach, but don't get the type of deal they want, and you see Zach start the season with the Bulls to raise his stock a bit, and then the Bulls try and move him for a better return before the deadline. That's honestly where I see all of this going. I could be wrong, but either way, I would love to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.